Okay, this lecture is for my Anatomy and Physiology 2 students. This is a lecture on the reproductive system. So we haven't been able to listen to our songs in class. The first link that I have for you to watch is a song. This is the song that I usually play when we start the reproductive system. Can you hear it? Yes, anything that gets the pollen to the pistils right over this. Okay, so it's a fun song. It's from the it's a Grease song, but I want you to listen to that one first. Okay, we're gonna have fun. We're gonna listen to that song first, and then I have two other videos for you to watch, and these are more of introductory videos. These are from the crash course, and I like the crash course videos. Of course, we're not going to talk about every single thing that's in the crash course videos, but I think it's a good introduction to the whole system. Now, you don't have to type these in. You can just click. Right below in the discussion box, I will have all of your videos that I want you to watch in order. So all you have to do is click down there and click on them, and they should open up. So watch your song, dance to the song, and then watch your two crash course videos, and I will see you on the second slide. Okay, so an introduction to the reproductive system. The similarities between male and female reproductive organs. Let's talk about those first. And these are the gonads. Now you can pronounce this either gonads or gonads. You know, I take those workshops in pronunciation, and actually either one is okay. Now these are the primary sex organs, the most important organs for both sexes. They secrete sex hormones, including testosterone and estrogens. Testosterone for male, estrogens for female. The gonads produce the gametes, and these are the sex cells, through a process of meiosis. So male gametes are called sperm, and female gametes are called ova, or egg cells. Both sexes have additional organs and structures called accessory reproductive organs that contribute to the functioning of their respective systems. So on the pictures that I have for you to look at on this particular slide, we see kind of an overview of the different anatomy. And then I have an actual photograph in a microscope of some eggs, 3 eggs, and you can see the actual sperm cells around them. Kind of neat to see. Okay, cell division. Cell division can occur either by mitosis, the process that all somatic cells are capable of, that produces identical daughter cells, or by meiosis. It's a special cell division that occurs in cells destined to become gametes. Now, fertilization. Fertilization is the process by which sperm and egg cell fuse to form a new single-celled offspring. We call that a zygote initially. The zygote eventually divides to produce all cells of the new individual. It must contain the correct number of chromosomes, and you're getting half from the ovum and half from the sperm. So for us in humans, the full complement of the chromosomes is 46. So each gamete will have 23. So 23 from the egg, 23 from the sperm, they're going to come together, and we're going to have our full complement of 46. Okay, first we're going to talk about males. So we're going to talk about the testicles. These are ovoid structures located outside the abdominopelvic cavity and sac-like structure composed of skin, smooth muscle, and connective tissue, what we call the scrotum. It contains highly coiled loops called seminiferous tubules, where the sperm is actually produced. Testes perform 2 important functions: sperm production and the secretion of androgen hormones. Androgen just means it's a type of hormone and the group of hormones, and primarily that would be testosterone. Now, one particular part of it, called the epididymis, the epididymis is filled with ductules. Now, ductules, that particular word, just means tiny ducts. And that is the site of sperm maturation and actually storage. The ductus deferens, which these parts you've been learning in lab, the ductus deferens can store sperm for months and reabsorb any sperm that has not been ejaculated over time. Sperm travels through a series of ducts bathed in semen secreted by accessory organs, it provides nourishment and support. The ducts are involved in ejaculation, which means sperm being expelled from the penis. I have a couple of pictures here of dissected human testes, kind of interesting to look at. So we talked about sperm being produced in the testes, but I also said something about semen. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, semen is a somewhat sticky, whitish mixture of sperm. Sperm actually makes up about only 5% of the semen volume, and all fluids from different anatomical structures that the sperm travels through. Now, let's talk about those particular structures and what they add to the semen. So first, the seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles secrete seminal fluid. That seminal fluid is a yellowish secretion that makes up about 60 to 70% of the semen volume. It's composed of a couple different things. One is fructose, and you'll remember that is a sugar. That's a sugar that the sperm utilize for ATP synthesis. They need a lot of ATP to move around, and so they're going to get that from some of that fructose. What also does it contribute? Prostaglandins. Prostaglandins stimulate smooth muscle contractions in both sex reproductive tracts and increase the sperm viability. Okay, and then we also have the prostate. So the prostate and the prostatic secretions make up about 20 to 30% of the semen volume. It's kind of like a milky fluid. So what it contributes some citrate. Citrate is another sugar that the sperm can utilize for ATP synthesis. It also contributes some coagulation proteins and enzymes. And it contributes what we call the prostate-specific antigen, or PSA, and other enzymes that will attempt to dissolve the semen clot in female reproductive tract to allow for the sperm to proceed into the tract. So what happens is after ejaculation, the semen will tend to coagulate. It will coagulate. It helps it kind of stay in one place. And then over time, it will get broken down into more of a liquidy substance with that PSA, and will allow for that the motility and the movement of the sperm. Okay, so it also includes some antimicrobial chemicals. It will inhibit some bacterial growth to decrease the risk of infection in the female reproductive system. And then both secretions, either from the seminal vesicles and the prostate, the pH of it. The pH is actually alkaline. It's alkaline so it can help neutralize the acids in the urethra and in the female reproductive tract. Okay, a typical ejaculate, the amount of semen expelled during one ejaculation is between 2.5 and 5 milliliters in volume. It contains between 40 and 750 million sperm cells. Now, 5 minutes post ejaculations, the semen coagulates due to the activities of those clotting proteins and from the seminal vesicles and enzymes from the prostate. It prevents the semen from leaking out of the female reproductive tract. After about 15 to 30 minutes, the semen clot breaks up due to the activity of the PSA and other anticoagulants that are produced by the prostate. The sperm cells are gradually released from the clot and activated and begin their ascent up the female reproductive tract. So on this slide, I do have a couple other, one is a photograph actually of sperm, so you can kind of see that. And then the other one is the path that the sperm takes into the reproductive tract. And what I really want you to notice is that it goes through the uterus and into the uterine tubes. Okay, now we're on to talk about the female. So females have the ovaries, and the ovaries are the female primary reproductive organ. They produce the gametes, the ova, and the hormones. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the eggs inside the ovaries. So the immature egg. The ovaries are full of immature eggs. what's also known as an oocyte, funny little word, oocyte, surrounded by layers of cells. And we're going to start describing what these are. We're going to get pretty specific in the development of these ova. So if the surrounding cells are one cell layer thick, we call them follicle cells. If the surrounding cells are more than one layer, we call these granulosa cells. So we got to learn a little bit of the terminology. Now, some of the pictures I have on this slide for you are actual micropictographs, and you can actually see different stages of development. For the ovaries are you're going to find different stages of development of all the follicles. So at any one given time, just like these pictures show, these actual pictures show, is that you're going to see all of these follicles in different stages of development. Now, stages of development of the follicles inside of the ovary. Now, there is a progression of development, and we're going to talk about each of these. So while I talk about them, you can actually look at that picture and try to find the one that I'm talking about. You can see where it is in that progression. So the first one is a primordial follicle. So primordial follicles, they're very, very tiny. The tiniest ones that you're actually going to see on that picture. Look over to the left. So the primordial follicles. Then they will develop into primary follicles. From the primary follicle into a secondary follicle. And we're going to talk about some of these. Then from a secondary follicle into what we call a vesicular follicle. An older term for this would be Graafian follicle. So remember I said we're getting away from eponyms. That means that body parts that are named after people who discovered them. That was the same thing for Graafian. We're getting away from calling it a Graafian follicle into a vesicular follicle. Okay, so by the time we get to a vesicular follicle, then typically ovulation will occur. So the ovulation will occur, and then we can also find some that are called the corpus luteum. Okay, corpus luteum. Okay, female sex cells are produced by a process called oogenesis. So the eggs by oogenesis, the sperm by spermatogenesis. You guys are going to learn both of those processes basically as part of your lab work. But I do want to go over just a little bit of the oogenesis, kind of an overview of the oogenesis. As a fetus, cells called oogonia, the diploid stem cells, divide by mitosis. They enter a growth phase, then they become primary oocytes, surrounded by a single layer of follicle cells. The primary oocytes begin their first meiotic division, then they stall. Then they stop. They stall in late prophase 1. By the time the baby girl is born, she has a lifetime supply of these, about 2 million. Pretty wild. So while the baby girl is developing in the uterus, right, in the mother, her eggs are already developing. So when she is born, she has all the eggs that she's ever going to have for the rest of her life. By puberty, about 400,000 remain. So we're going to lose some of them over time. And about 450 will be released throughout her lifetime, about once a month. So at puberty, a small number of these primary oocytes are activated each month, but only one is selected per month to continue meiosis 1. And that's also called the secondary oocyte. So pretty wild. You know, that might be a new concept to you, that when the baby is born, they have all of the eggs that they're going to have. It's pretty wild. And, you know, even by puberty, they have 400,000 left. That's quite a bit, right? 450 throughout their life will be expelled, ovulated. Okay, the monthly series of events that occurs within the ovaries is called the ovarian cycle. And one egg or ovum escapes the ovary, and we call that ovulation. If penetrated by the sperm, only if penetrated by the sperm, the secondary oocyte, what was just the egg, right? The common the egg, completes meiosis two. So it's still kind of in that state of suspended animation of development, and it will not continue its development until it is penetrated by the sperm. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how does this even start? We know that it starts at puberty, but what really is the trigger for this to happen? So as the little girl grows, as her body grows, her ovaries grow as well. And they grow and secrete small amounts of estrogen. So the smaller the ovary, the smaller amount of estrogen. That makes sense. That small amount of estrogen in the blood inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing one of its hormones, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. Now, as the little girl gets larger, as her body gets larger, her ovaries get larger, and the ovaries start producing more estrogens, certain types of estrogens. So the larger the ovary, the larger the body, the larger the ovaries, the more of this estrogen is there. Now, as puberty nears, the gonadotropic releasing hormone actually starts being released. So it starts being released. It's no longer being inhibited. Now, once the gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, now I want you to look at the picture that's right above me, then it's going to stimulate the pituitary. The pituitary will then release some hormones. They're going to release two hormones, and we're going to talk more about these hormones later, but they will release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And those particular hormones have its target at the ovary. All right, so then at that point, this is when the girl's period would start. So this is when the ovarian cycle would start, and also the uterine cycle. So there's two major cycles going on when we talk about the female, ovarian and uterine. We haven't gotten to uterine yet. Okay, still thinking of ovarian cycle. So when we're talking about monthly cycles of the ovarian cycle, there are two monthly phases. And those phases, the first phase is called the follicular phase, and that's usually days 1 through 14. And the phases are demarcated by the ovulation occurring. The second phase is called the luteal phase, and the luteal phase happens between days 14 and 28. Now, why am I so specific with the days? A typical ovarian cycle repeats about every 28 days. Now, you're going to read in your textbook about the 28 days. That's the way we teach it. That's an average, okay? The 28 days is just an average. So some women will have an ovarian cycle that anywhere from 21 days to 40 days, with their ovulation happening somewhere right in the middle, okay? And even some women will have 21, what we call irregular, and they won't be the same every single month. There are certain factors that will affect how long certain parts of the ovarian cycle last, okay? And as you can imagine, it's a little bit of hormone driven. All right, so this happens once they hit puberty. We're going through this ovarian cycle. For women, I said that throughout their lifetime, they can ovulate about 450 eggs or oocytes, and up until a certain point. And that certain point we call menopause. At menopause happens anywhere from probably 40 to 55 years old, or maybe even older. And this is when menopause, what demarcates the menopause is that you will not have a period for a year. So you're not ovulating anymore after that. You don't, ovulate eggs, you don't have a period because of that. Okay, the ovarian cycle, what we just talked about, coincides with another cycle called the uterine cycle. So the uterine cycle, also called the menstrual cycle, describes the monthly changes in the endometrium, the inner wall of the uterus, that prepares the uterus to sustain a fetus. So I want you to take a look at the picture I have up on the screen, and it shows you the different phases of the uterine cycle. So the ovarian cycle has phases, so does the uterine cycle. So for the uterine cycle, you have the menses, which is the release of the endometrium, the inner wall, and that's when you would typically, that's what we call the period. Then you have a proliferative phase. You have the proliferative phase, and then you have the secretory phase. So there's different phases of the uterine cycle. And we're going to talk about these, and then we're going to talk about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle and kind of put them both together and to understand really what's going on throughout the month. All right, get a little bit more in detail about this uterine cycle. So days 1 through 5, and I'm giving you the numbers on a typical 28-day cycle. So days 1 through 5, we're in that menstrual phase. Okay, and I said menstrual phase, the menses. This is when you would be having your period. Days 6 through 14 is what we call proliferative. Proliferative, you're proliferating, making more, and we're going to talk about you're going to make more of the endometrium. You're building up the endometrium later. This is pre-ovulatory, so ovulation hasn't happened yet in the ovaries. Days 15 through 28 we call the secretory. So secretory, not that they're telling secrets, but that they will secrete certain substances. Think of secretory, think of secreting substances. So now we have certain glands within the endometrium that have the ability to secrete substances. So that's post-ovulatory. That means this happens after ovulation. Now I've been teaching this a while, and the best way I have found to do for understanding for my students is to talk about the ovarian and the uterine cycle both together. So because they're happening at the same time, we just have to know what's going on in the ovaries, what's going on with the uterus, because both of them, it's kind of like they talk to each other. Think of it this way. So in this particular story, think of them as one is dependent on the other, right? Just like a conversation. So what we're going to do is I'm going to address both of these cycles, and we're going to run through a typical month. Okay, we're going to run through a typical month. Now, when I'm doing this in our regular face-to-face class, I will be writing these words that I have on your screen on the board, and I'm pointing out on the screen with this exact same picture where we are and what's going on with each. So while I'm talking, right, I would like you to look at that picture and follow along with the picture. Where we're going to start is days 1 through 14. So, of course, we're starting at day 1 and what's going on. We're going to talk about what's going on in the uterus, what's going on in the ovaries. So days 1 through 14. Now, if we're looking at the uterus and the uterine cycle, we're in the menstrual phase. We're in the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. What's going on? The layer of the endometrium, the endometrial layer of the uterus starts to slough off. What does slough mean? Slough is a funny little word. That means that the blood vessels that are supplying the endometrial layer kink and break and completely break apart, and that inner layer will come off. Okay? That's how that happens. The inner layer completely comes off. Now, that part of that bleeding and the tissue is part of the period that will come out. That usually happens between 1 and 5 days, the first 5 days. Okay, so menstrual phase, days 1 through 5. Now let's flip over and think about what's going on in the ovary. So we're looking at what's happening in the ovarian cycle. And I hope that you're looking at the picture. So in the ovarian cycle, we're in the follicular phase. Follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. Follicular phase should remind you of follicles. Okay, so gonadotropin releasing hormone. Well, I said that that's a hormone that is being released from the hypothalamus. The levels are increasing, therefore increasing the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So if gonadotropin releasing hormone is high, it's going to stimulate the pituitary, and the pituitary is going to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These particular hormones have an effect on the ovary. Okay, follicle stimulating hormone, that's an easy name. I like that name. It tells you what that hormone does. Okay, luteinizing hormone also has an effect on development of those follicles. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are now acting on the ovaries to stimulate follicle growth. Okay, so we're picking up where we left off. We're still in days 1 through 14. So in days 1 through 14 of the ovarian cycle, that is the follicular phase. So if I were to point this out on your picture, about right there, okay, of the ovarian cycle. Now, if we look at the uterus, what's going on at the uterus right now? So we've already had our menstrual phase, and now we're moving on to what's on your picture, the pre-ovulatory phase. And the pre-ovulatory phase, we call that the proliferative phase. So we're start to building up that endometrial layer. So what's going on for each of these? And also in our hypothalamus. A single secondary follicle has outgrown the others. So all of the follicles were stimulated to progress. And one single secondary follicle has outgrown the others and become the dominant follicle. That follicle produces estrogen and inhibin, two hormones. Now let's address the estrogen. If it's producing estrogen, additional estrogen, if we look in the blood, we'll have rising level of estrogen. So as this follicle gets bigger, the more estrogen that it produces. We have a rising level of estrogen in the blood. That rising estrogen level in the blood, increasing level, exerts a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus. This will actually turn the hypothalamus off from producing and secreting the gonadotropin releasing hormone. We learned about how these hormone interactions work when we talked about the endocrine system. So a rising level can make something happen in our body. So the rising level of estrogen in the body exerts a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus turns off the gonadotropin releasing hormone. If the hypothalamus does not release the gonadotropin releasing hormone, what happens in the pituitary? Hopefully, you said that the pituitary is not stimulated to release the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So it basically turns the pituitary off from those hormones as well. Okay, so now we know what's going on in the ovaries. Now let's flip down and take a look at what's going on in the uterus. This rising level of estrogen in the blood also stimulates the repair of the endometrium. So we start adding more and more to the endometrium. The cells proliferate, the thickness doubles. And so it is that estrogen that will stimulate that proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. We're building it back up. So with estrogen, low amounts of estrogen, moderate amounts of estrogen, rising levels of estrogen, no estrogen in the blood, all of those different factors play a role. All of those will have something different happen. So it's just not, is it present or not? It all really has to do with how much of it is in the blood and is it increasing. So If moderate estrogen levels, rising levels of estrogen, moderate or rising levels of estrogen turn off gonadotropin releasing hormones, what happens is that higher levels can do something different. I know it's crazy. So now flip back up, and I want you to kind of look right here where I'm going to circle. And we're just about at 14, almost at day 14. This dominant follicle, okay, it's gotten huge. There's one, it's dominant, it's big. The inhibin, I said, well, we learned about what the estrogen did, but the inhibin, what it does is it attempts to prevent other follicles from getting any bigger. So even though FSH and LH are still bathing the uterus, the inhibin is keeping all the others from developing very quickly. So now we have this one big one, right? We have this one big secondary follicle that's producing this estrogen, the estrogen is making certain things happen. It's turning off the gonadotropin releasing hormone. If it gets a moderate level, it's turning it off. So no more FSH and LH. Then the bigger it gets, the more inhibin that it produces, and it will inhibit the other follicles from developing. All right. So as what I want you to imagine in your mind is this one big follicle developing and producing those hormones. Okay. Now, moderate levels of estrogen, moderate or rising levels of estrogen in the blood turn off, exert a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus, therefore turning off the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and therefore not stimulating the pituitary. However, we're getting up to day 14. So we're at day 13, right? So let's say we're at day 13 to 14. And that secondary follicle is so big and producing so much estrogen that the female now has the most amount of estrogen she's going to have throughout the entire month. Okay? And a high level of estrogen does something different. A high level of estrogen, when it reaches a certain point in the blood, guess what it does to the hypothalamus? It turns the hypothalamus on. It turns the hypothalamus on and makes it secrete the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And not just a little, it will actually stimulate a high level of estrogen, stimulates the hypothalamus to secrete a lot of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It secretes a lot of it into the blood. It just secretes a bunch of it all at once. And then the gonadotropin releasing hormone will have an effect on the pituitary, the neighboring pituitary. So if there's a bunch of the gonadotropin releasing hormone being released, it acts on the pituitary. It tells the pituitary to release a bunch of the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And if we have none in the blood, and now we have a bunch in the blood, we call that a surge, okay? A surge of hormones. So at 1 minute we have none, and the other minute we have a lot being released into the blood, we call that a surge. So let me back up. All right, let me back up and say that again, because these are hormone pathways, and hormone pathways are sometimes hard to understand, especially if I don't have my board to write on. So the secondary follicle at this point is releasing a high amount of estrogen, the highest amount that she's going to have throughout the entire month. Then that has an effect on the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases a bunch of gonadotropin releasing hormone all at one time. Okay, we call that a burst. It has a burst of gonadotropin releasing hormone. That burst of gonadotropin releasing hormone has an effect on the pituitary. It's going to cause the pituitary to release a burst of the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone into the blood. So one day we have none, little. Next day we have a lot, all goes into the blood. We call that a surge. So we now are experiencing a surge of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone in the blood. We have a lot per se. Okay, this surge of luteinizing hormone causes the oocyte to be released from the ovary. All right, so where are we now? We are here, right, for ovulation. It is that surge of LH into the blood, therefore hitting its target, and its target is going to be the ovaries. And what is it going to cause it to do? It's going to cause that secondary follicle, that vesicular follicle at this point, now it's called a vesicular follicle, to rupture. It'll cause it to rupture, and the egg will be released, and we call that ovulation. So the surge of LH basically prompted ovulation. The surge of LH will prompt ovulation, but it takes about 24 hours. Okay, it takes about 24 hours. So after that surge of LH hits the blood, within 24 hours, you should have ovulation. Now, there are such things as ovulation tests, even at like drugstores, like Walmart, Walgreens. You can buy ovulation tests. These would be for someone who maybe is looking for the optimum time to get pregnant, okay? And knowing when ovulation occurs is a good thing if you're trying to get pregnant, okay? Because you need to know when you're going to ovulate, right? If you're going to plan it out like that, then you need to know when you ovulate. Because sperm only lasts inside the human body about 3 days. Okay, so ovulation tests, what are they actually picking up on? These are urinalysis. It's a urinalysis, right? So it's like a thing that you dip in your urine or hold in the urine stream. And what is it picking up on? That urinalysis is picking up on the luteinizing hormone. So the degree, how much luteinizing hormone you have in your urine, therefore in the blood. And if the level is high enough, then it knows that you've already had that surge of luteinizing hormone and ovulation is imminent. Okay, so moving on. So ovulation occurs around mid-cycle, about day 14 on a 28-day cycle. Now we're into the different phase. So once ovulation occurs, that's the demarcation of the ovarian cycle, and that pushes us into the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So this surge of luteinizing hormone transforms the ruptured follicle into what we call a corpus luteum. So it no longer holds the egg, and it actually gets transformed into a different type of entity called this corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow, so we're looking for a yellow body. That's what it means. Now, this corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts secreting progesterone and estrogens. So now its major job is to produce these hormones. The hormones hit the blood. This exerts a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus, and it turns off the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Therefore, turns off the pituitary from releasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. All right, now let's flip over to talk about what's going on in the uterus. All right, so hopefully you're looking at this picture. The endometrium, now we're getting into the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. The endometrium prepares for implantation. It secretes, right? Produces and secretes mucus and glycogen for the potential developing embryo. So now the endometrial layer is big, it's fluffy, and now it's secreting mucus, this nice mucus and glycogen for the potentially developing embryo. So we're into the post-ovulatory phase, or what we call the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. Now we're going to talk about what if no fertilization occurs. Then what happens? After this, we'll talk about what if fertilization does occur. So first, if no fertilization occurs, now you have a different table right above me, and it's just a different view. So it's just like the table that we looked at on the last slide, but we're adding in a few more factors. So we can't just talk about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle separate, right? And what's going on with the hormones. This shows you kind of an at a glance all of those factors together. This table also includes basal body temperature. We won't address that right now. We're talking about mainly our reproductive system and what's going on there. So we won't address that at all. Now, if no fertilization occurs, now we talked about this corpus luteum. Remember, corpus luteum means yellow body. So we're talking here. Let me pick this up. Right, here's our corpus luteum that we're referring to. Now, our corpus luteum transformed, if no fertilization occurs, our corpus luteum that was once producing the progesterone and estrogen transforms into what we call a corpus albicans. Albicans means white, so a white body. When it does this, it stops secreting progesterone and estrogen. So we have none of the level in the blood drops. If we're no longer have that in the blood, if we no longer have progesterone and estrogen, mainly estrogen, in the blood, we're no longer turning off the hypothalamus, therefore the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So the absence or the very low amount of this in the blood, what happens is it's going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Therefore, stimulate the pituitary to release the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. When it does this, you guys already know what those hormones do. They are going to start developing new follicles. So as soon as it turns into a corpus albicans, no more hormone in the blood, no more estrogen in the blood, very little estrogen in the blood, then the hypothalamus kicks in, releases the gonadotropin releasing hormone, therefore stimulates the pituitary to release FSH and LH, and we start developing new follicles. Now, if no progesterone, so the corpus luteum is not producing any progesterone anymore, then that has an effect on the uterus. So if no progesterone, the functional layer of the uterus, the endometrium, is now prompted to slough off. So the lack or very low level of progesterone is the trigger for the endometrial layer to break off. Okay, so then we're right back at day 1. So the first day of the period of that menstrual phase of the uterine cycle, we're back at day 1. Now we want to know what happens if fertilization does occur. So the chorion of the developing embryo, so if we have fertilization, we have a developing embryo. And there's layers that surround this developing embryo, and one of them is called a chorion. So the chorion of the developing embryo produces a hormone, and that's called human chorionic gonadotropin. And it's abbreviated as a lowercase h and capital C, capital G. So human chorionic gonadotropin. And it will start producing this just about to detectable levels at about a week after fertilization. So this is a hormone, goes into the blood. Now this hormone has its target at the corpus luteum. This hormone prompts the corpus luteum to continue producing progesterone and estrogen for about another 2 to 3 months. Let's remember what that estrogen and progesterone was doing, right? So that estrogen was turning off the hypothalamus from producing any more gonadotropin releasing hormone, therefore any LH and FSH from the pituitary. The progesterone was the progesterone was
helping out the uterus. Okay, so it was helping to stimulate the endometrial layer to become secretory. All right, now this human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, that is the hormone that is detected in pregnancy tests. You can get a blood test and they're going to check for the level of this hormone, or you can do it by urinalysis. Those are the ones that you would buy at the drugstore. So the pregnancy tests that you would hold in the urine, it's looking for the human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, so fertilization. Fertilization optimally occurs in the uterine tubes. So this is new to some people. Now, once ovulation occurs, and where I want you to look is that far picture here. Ovulation occurs, the egg, right, is now swept into the uterine tubes. Swept into the uterine tubes, there are ciliated cells that line the uterine tubes. That's always kind of beating in one direction. And so it helps it to move it into those uterine tubes. Now, fertilization optimally occurs in the uterine tubes, not in the uterus. This is maybe something that you've never heard of before, but optimally it will occur in the uterine tubes. Okay, and then it will start developing, and then about 5 days later, it will actually reach the uterus and be prime. And I mean prime by, it will be in a certain stage of development that will be very advantageous for it to get implanted into the uterus. Now, on our next lecture, we're going to talk about development. So we're going to kind of pick up where we left off on this slide. Now, I know we talked about a lot in this lecture, a lot of hormones, a lot of hormone interactions, and what does it make those targets do? So the reproductive system is really driven by those structures, the hormones, and those glands that all work together. So I do have 3 videos for you to watch. Now, if you understood every single thing that I said, perfect. Now, if you want to hear it again, certain parts of it again, and maybe kind of refresh or kind of to hear someone else describe it, I have 3 short videos for you to watch, and they're through Khan Academy. I think Khan Academy is pretty good as well, and I've selected 3 of them that describe kind of the hardest parts of the female reproductive cycles. So if you watch these, I want you to watch these in order, and I will put these links right down at the bottom, okay? All right, so this ends this lecture. Our last lecture is coming up, and it will be over development. So we're kind of picking up where we left off after, I was going to say, fertilization occurs, and we're going to walk through that development. What happens? When does it get implanted? How does it get implanted? And go from there.